Okay, so we're going to talk now about eco-geomorphology. This is a term that's come up in the last few years, but it's trying to relate both changes in the structure of vegetation within the ecosystem with the hydrology, how the water is utilised by plants, and also how the plants interact with the sediment transport, the geomorphology side of the story. So it's a relationship between plants, the hydrology and the geomorphology that is the centre of that sort of study. And I'm going to give you some examples and some from my own work on looking at vegetation patterns. So when we fly over the northwest of Australia, we often see patterns like this. We see vegetation which is aligned along erosional features, in this case a dry ephemeral creek bed. And we can see on the hill slope, there's also vegetation which is aligned in the direction of the slope. And so this system has self-organised, right? The vegetation has decided these are good places to grow, probably because they're going to get more water, right? And the landscape has self-organised too. It's developed this drainage feature from a hill slope and is eroding, which is further feeding back onto where the plants are going to grow. And that's sort of the centre of geomorphology. It's looking at those sort of feedbacks and interactions. Right. So we're going to briefly look at vegetation impacts. So vegetation impacts friction, right? And surface roughness. Vegetation increase Manning's N. They increase the roughness coefficient. They make the Darcy-Weisbach friction factor higher. Right? They increase the amount of friction. They interact with the flow field and they slow the velocity of overland flow. Right? And remember, the velocity, the higher the velocity, the higher the sediment transport. So if they're going to slow the flows, they're going to slow the sediment transport. Vegetation can also increase the opportunity for infiltration to occur because plants impact soils. Plants increase soil organic carbon, they add nutrients, they are homes for plant and other animals and other plants. So you have things like bioturbation going on. You have like little ferrets living underneath trees in the ground, which increase infiltration rates. And so all that can lead to enhanced deposition of sediments. And of course, plant canopies can intercept rainfall and reduce rain splash erosion. There are indirect impacts of plants too, like we mentioned before. Plants, dry soils, they increase the matrix potential and therefore increase the infiltration rates and reduce the amount of runoff that happens. Plants impact soil properties, like I said before, through biodiversity, providing organic carbon and essentially which allows particles to have increased cohesion, but also increased hydraulic connectivity. So you can look at positive feedbacks between biomass and infiltration, and people have done this in the past. And they look at, for example, the mean infiltration rates in undisturbed vegetated patches versus the spaces between canopies, right, or the intercanopy areas. Right. So in this case, they look at undisturbed vegetation patches versus disturbed intercanopies, and they compared the infiltration rates here. Were, I think the units are millimetres per hour. So the under a eucalypt savanna, under the canopy it was 75, and the intercanopy it was 53. And then in disturbed intercanopy areas where you had, say, animals walking over the top, compacting the soil and so on, then the hydraulic connectivity or the infiltration rates reduced to 13 millimetres per hour. And you can see that also in mulga woodlands and in pinon juniper woodlands. But the interesting thing is, vegetation greatly increases the infiltration rate. In this case, more than 10 times, right? More than, or nearly double in this case, and nearly a factor of 1.5 in this case. And a lot of these feedbacks and interactions are in this framework that I've mentioned previously by Ludwig and Tongwei. In semi-arid systems, often we have a trigger event, which is a rainstorm, which leads to rainfall. Then we have a transfer process, and this is spatial redistribution of resources within the landscape. So this is runoff, which carries water, nutrients, and sediments with it. Then there's a reserve of some of those things within the landscape. So water and sediments and nutrients are reserved in patches, and that reserve leads to a pulse of growth, right? And then that pulse, and some of the materials are actually lost, right, from the landscape. And the reserves can then feed back and increase the amount of plants or decrease the amount of plants in certain areas depending upon how much was lost and how much was reserved. And so there's all these feedbacks and interactions here: recycling of nutrients, uptake of water for growth, changes to surface roughness, right, as the plants grow and so on, as crusts keep growing. And so this framework here is really a good starting point for understanding some of these processes and interactions. They have a nice review paper where they look at that framework, but also in the context of erosion. So in the paper, vegetation patches and runoff erosion as interacting eco-hydrological processes in semi-arid papers is well worth a read. And I'd highly recommend that as a starting point for your literature review if you're going to do eco-geomorphology. And they say in that paper, if vegetation patches obstruct runoff flows during rainfall events, how much more soil water is stored in these patches compared to open interpatch areas, right? If inputs of water are higher in patches, how much stronger is the pulse of plant growth compared to interpatches? And they review the various observations around these questions in that paper. So, for example, if you look at the runoff and run-on, so run-on is the water that flows into an area, right, from upslope, and runoff is the water that runs away from that area. Okay. So if you have an area of soil, runoff can be the water flowing in, a run-on is the water flowing in, and runoff is the water flowing out, right? And by patchy landscapes, they mean landscapes where you have clumps of vegetation together, and that's separated by bare soil or low biomass areas in between. And what they did, they measured, for example, the integrated net water flow, right, as a function of the amount of bare soil, intercanopy bare soil percent. So very little bare soil here, very high bare soil at this end. Okay. And they measured the integrated water flow, right? So on this side of the ledger, there was net runoff, and there was net runoff always in the intercanopy bare soil areas for all these different sites. And it was always around the same amount, around 0.45 to 0.5, right? Centimetres per cell, whatever their cell area is. This was actually measured. And where you had canopies, you had net run-on, right? So you had more water flowing in than you had water flowing out. Okay. And this is underneath canopies, and then you had actually more being stored where you had intercanopy herbaceous vegetation, so things like grasses. Right. So intercanopy bare soil lost a lot of water. Intercanopy grasses retained a lot of water, and intercanopy, where you had shrubs and trees, retained water. Right? Because you can see the redistribution of water in this landscape was from bare areas to vegetated areas. And it decreased, and you get more capture by vegetation as you get more bare soil, right? A greater percentage of bare areas. So also in that review, one of the questions they asked, if more soil water in patches promotes greater biological activity by organisms such as earthworms, that creates things like macropores and changes to soil structure, how does it improve the infiltrability of soil? So how can a soil increase its infiltration rates, right, depending upon biological activity? And the other question, if vegetation patches are damaged on a hill slope, how much does this increase runoff and erosion and decrease biomass production? All right, so looking at these interactions and feedbacks. And so there's a nice paper by Sally Thompson from Berkeley who who did a meta-analysis of all these studies that looked at the impact of biomass on infiltration rates from around the world. And essentially, you can go into some of the detail about some of the site differences and all that sort of stuff, but essentially, the more biomass you have, the greater the infiltration rate. Right? And it was non-linear slope. So a log-log means this is a power law relationship with an exponent of 0.4. Right? So the more biomass you have, generally speaking, the higher your infiltration rates are going to be. Right, so we're going to talk now about a little case study, and I've showed some of these pictures before from Bartley's paper, and they looked at factors influencing the amount of spatial arrangement of ground cover in a savanna in Australia, and they looked at how sites with similar total vegetation cover but different spatial structure had different water and sediment yields, right, from the hill slope. They looked at patchiness of that vegetation and how that related to sediment yield. And they also looked at temporal relationships between rainfall, runoff and sediment yield and the impact of grazing on hill slopes. Right. And they also looked at soil properties like infiltration. So that Bartley paper is well worth a read too, and I recommend you pick that up. So here's an example. They had 3 hill slopes with about the same amount of vegetation cover across the whole site. However, there were different patterns of cover. So in Flume 1, it was very heterogeneous with low biomass regions and high biomass patches. Flume 2 was a little bit less variable and more evenly distributed across the entire hill slope. And Flume 3 was the opposite. So we had a low biomass at the outlet and relatively high biomass at the top of the hill. These were the flumes, which I showed you before, coming off the bottom of these 3 hill slopes during dry conditions and then again during wet conditions. And so these are the results from 3 different years, 2003, 4 and 5, flumes 1, 2 and 3. And you can refer back to the previous slides if you want to remember which one's which in terms of vegetation cover. And you can see the total rainfall was, quite similar, varied by about 45, 49 millimeters between the 3 years. Okay, similar amounts of rainfall on each flume in each of the years. A little bit less on Flume 3 in 2005. And they also had different utilisation of the land as well, right? So there were cattle grazing the land and there was no spelling. That means the cattle weren't taken off the land in 2003. Well, there was 25% utilisation, right? Because what that means is only 25% of the area was utilised because there was very little pasture growth during that year. In 2004, they had a full wet season, 4 months of utilisation and 35% of the area was utilised. And then in the last year, 6 months was utilised and again 35% of the area. And now you can see the total amount of runoff and the total amount of sediment yield from the different plots. So Flume 1, Flume 2 and Flume 3. And so Flume 3 had the highest amounts of sediment of runoff and also the highest amounts of sediment load compared to the other 2 sites in all the years studied. Right, and we go back and we can have a look at the organisation of the vegetation in this particular site here. So we had low biomass areas here, it's high biomass at the top of the catchment, whereas these other 2 flumes had much more even distributions of vegetation, even though Flume 1 was quite heterogeneous and Flume 2 was quite homogeneous. But this low biomass towards the bottom of the catchment really had a big impact on the total amount of sediment yield, and so a lot of the sediments were probably being lost from this area and being mobilised then off the site. Right? Cause some of the differences. They were able to get relationships between the infiltration rate and the percent vegetation cover, right? Similar to Sally Thompson's work. So the infiltration rate increased quite dramatically as a function of vegetation cover. And they came up with some sort of erosion infiltration index, which they were able to establish, again, that depended upon biomass cover. Okay. This was a connectivity index, this infiltration index. You can look it up if you want the details. Right. So let's have a look more about these soil vegetation impacts. So vegetation impacts soil hydrology. You can imagine on a hill slope you get water flowing down the hill, being captured by plants in parts of the hill, and then you get a decrease in the flow velocities on the other side of the hill, and then a build up in the flow velocities, and then increased capture by another patch of plants. And it turns out that this type of process is exactly what causes what's called banded vegetation. You can see these stripes or bands of vegetation that could be up between, say, 20 and 500 meters wide, and you can have spacing between the bands of, say, 50 meters and several kilometers. Right? And these patterns are common in areas with rainfall between 50 and maybe not as high as 700 mils, but between 50 and say 500 millimeters of rainfall. And also you find them not only in Africa, but all over Western Australia and Australia. Here's an example from near Alice Springs and in New South Wales. Widespread areas where you have these self-organised vegetation patterns. Now the vegetation doesn't occur like this because the geology is banded like this. They come about this because of this interaction between plants and the hydrology. In this case, their bands are not trees, but they're little grasses. When you head down to the ground, they can look like this. So in large parts of Western Australia, they look like this. They have these mulga trees or Acacia anura with grassy or sandy zones in between. Here's what that looks like from the air. And again, this one's from near Alice Springs, where you have these bands of grasses and little centrefold shrubs separated by almost bare soil areas. Really quite pretty pictures. This one's from the Pilbara. This one's from the Pilbara. This one's from Africa, where you have banded vegetation giving way to a, clearly it was a fluvial landscape. And when you zoom in on that, you can see a really nice transition from banded into a fluvial drainage pattern. It's quite amazing. You can also get drainage patterns which show some degree of self-organisation, even though they're much less regular, where the vegetation sort of oriented downslope and quite irregular. And again from the Pilbara, we have bands which are interacting with some sort of erosional process in the landscape. And this is my favourite. We have banded vegetation alongside a fractal drainage line, right? You get this ephemeral drainage line, grasses surrounding trees, mulga, acacia anura, and these bands which are up on this flat, gradually inclined plateau, again formed from trees of mulga. So this is where we think they occur, and you can see they occur on the fringes of deserts in the Sahel, Africa, in Somalia, down in Arizona and Mexico, potentially down here in Argentina, and over large parts of Australia. And this is why it's so relevant for us, because we have large parts of the continent which are occupied by these banded vegetation. The bands are associated with soil crusts of different types, and there's a nice paper by Valentin which describes how the soil feedbacks lead to different soil crusts and different parts of the banded vegetation system. And there's also other evidence shown by Valentin of these biophysical feedbacks. This is the number of biopores, right, per 0.25 of a square metre. So the biopores are things like ant holes, wormholes and that sort of thing. So almost none seen in the bare ground, As soon as you get into the vegetated zone with the trees, then you get a much greater increase in the number of these biopores, and of course that's going to increase your infiltration rates. Ludwig and these guys actually measured the water content distribution in and across these groves of mulga and intergroves, and you can see this is the cumulative amount of water that's stored with depth in millimeters of water. And you can see in the intergrove we have 100 millimeters of water, but underneath the mulga grove at the end of the wet season there's 600 millimeters of water stored. So you can see there's a big advantage for the trees to have this biophysical feedback. And then we go back into the intergrove and the total amount of water stored is much less. And here's a really nice example. This is again by Ludwig, and what they did is they installed some neutron moisture meters to measure the water content distribution with depth down to 1.5 meters before and after a tropical cyclone went over the top. So this tropical cyclone dropped a few hundred millimeters of water, I think, and before the rainfall event, the water content in the intergrove and the grove was about the same. Was it 25 millimeters over 1.5 meters depth. Then after the tropical cyclone went through, the water content in the groved trees increased to 250 millimeters and then gradually decreased as the plants used up all that water. Whereas in the intergrove, only about 75 millimeters of water got stored. And again, that was depleted by soil evaporation and drainage. So we've constructed a model to be able to reproduce some of these patterns. We have a hydrological model which routes water through landscapes. We have plants which can grow and die depending upon how much water they get. And we have plants which impact the soil properties and have feedbacks to the soil so they can change how much water is captured by overland flow. So we set up a simple model where we have a rough landscape and a smooth landscape. And you can see here the flow lines show that it's very rough and we can have some sort of flow accumulation. And on this side it's very smooth and all the water's running straight down the hill. And we start off the model with vegetation distributed evenly. Now we don't tell the plants to grow into bands or into stripes down the slope, but the plants sort of figure out that it's sort of a good way to organise themselves anyway. And so gradually over time we get the development of downslope oriented network of trees like this on the rough landscape, and we get bands of vegetation oriented across the slope like we see in nature on the smooth side of the landscape. So the results suggest that there's strong feedbacks between the local scale hydrology, which is caused by the surface roughness, and the vegetation patterns that result. And we've gone on further, and then we can introduce erosion into this model. And so what we do is we start off with a smooth planar hill slope. Here's a cross section of that hill with no microtopography, and we have heterogeneous distribution of vegetation. And this is the top-down views, and this is the flow pathways on those hills with the water flowing down the hill this way. And here's a cross section through the hill after the first couple of years. And so what we can see is that over time we get the development of microtopography, we get the vegetation wanting to orient across into bands, and the flow pathways start to become a little bit more variable because we've got erosion processes happening. And gradually over time we get the development of the bands, we get the development of microtopography, and interestingly we get this stepped microtopography with the bands of trees occupying the steepest parts of the landscape, right? And it turns out this is exactly what we see when we go to these banded vegetation sites. We see this stepped microtopography, and we see the groves of trees occupying these slight changes in gradient over time. And this is exactly what Dunkley and Brown measured. I've just flipped their picture around from their paper so it matches ours, but the backward G's here measure the groves of trees, and the I's are the intergroves. And you can see that the groves are occupying the steepest parts of the hill, even though this is really quite small, right? goes from 0 to minus 2 meters in elevation over 150 meters. Right? So it's 160 meters. It's really quite shallow slope. But the groves of vegetation here occupy the steepest parts of the landscape, and so our model is able to reproduce some of these observations. And what's interesting is now we can use models like this to start to explore really more complex landscapes where we have lumpy microtopographies and vegetation forming these, irregular networks on hills. And this is where we're taking the model. So there's interesting processes happening in desert landscapes, and what we're seeing, and what people are seeing all over the world actually, is an increasing woodiness of vegetation in desert landscapes. It's called shrubby encroachment or woody encroachment, and you're seeing the transition from grasslands often into shrubby lands, and this has an impact on the geomorphology, because what we get is, instead of getting an even cover of grasses with biomass close to the soil surface where it can impact raindrops and also intercept overland flow quickly, and it's got canopies close to the soil surface, all these things are reducing the amount of erosion. Whereas we transition then into a shrubby landscape with large, sometimes large shrubs separated by large distances between other shrubs, we get this mound development under the shrubs due to rain splash. We get protection of that surface by canopies, and so we get the build-up of little mounds. Then, because we have these larger interpatch areas with lower biomass in between, and the accumulation of surface runoff, we can get increased erosion. And so this transition from grasses to woody vegetation is actually leading to enhanced erosion in some parts of the world, and maybe permanent transitions from grasses into these types of landscapes because the topography is all changing. Wainwright and his colleagues have measured the effect of erosion on grasslands and shrublands, and of course when they looked in simple experiments using, say, a rainfall simulator, they measured much higher rates of erosion from shrublands as compared to the grassland soils. Right, so shrubby encroachment is altering the eco-geomorphology. In large parts of Western Australia, up in the Pilbara and northeast Queensland, New South Wales, we have these massive floods that move through the landscape, and when they do, they move massive amounts of vegetation. And they interact with the vegetation in a really interesting way. And you can see a big scour hole on the upstream side of this pile of vegetation debris that's been piled up against some living trees. And so there's large-scale impacts on channel morphology, leading to anabranching networks and really interesting non-linear type river flows over large floodplains. So this sort of interaction between vegetation and erosion processes is also happening not just at hill slope scales, but at much larger catchment scales, which makes it kind of interesting. And also, Joanna Neild, another Australian who's working out of Southampton University, has been developing models looking at biodiversity of plant function in aeolian landscapes where we have sediment transport by wind. And so she's building models to understand how we get different types of sand dunes, or close to the coast. She's a coastal geomorphologist. Different types of these sand dune forms, and how they're interacting with different types of vegetation. And so if we're going to rehabilitate landscapes like this, we really need to understand some of these interactions and be able to make predictions about them. So this is why I think that paper of hers and some of the others that she's done are really interesting and novel. So in summary, biophysical feedbacks, they're exciting and important. Get into it. Vegetation structure can arise from these these intrinsic processes. We have facilitation processes and competition processes, and sediment transport is part of that story. Okay? And by facilitation, I mean plants are impacting the hydrology to benefit themselves into patches, right? But at the same time, we also have competition between plants for nutrients and water, which there's a balance between this competition and facilitation that must be met somewhere. Surface water redistribution is an important part of that process, and of course that means you're going to have erosion happening and an interaction then with vegetation. So if we're going to start designing ecosystems and design rehabilitation, we should probably start to take into account some of these interactions between vegetation, soils and the hydrology.